Let's talk about the president who is president, isn't really doing any presidenting, and the president who isn't president, but is. Did you get all that? There's going to be a quiz at the end of the show. Hey, everybody, I'm Steve Green with Bill Whittle and Scott Ott. This is Right Angle, brought to you by the members of BillWhittle.com. Gentlemen, we gotta talk about North Carolina, Asheville, Hurricane Helene. The chat on Twitter, now known as X, at very early on Tuesday, and these numbers are not yet confirmed, is that the first numbers of deceased in western North Carolina are in the mid-hundreds. On Sunday and Monday, we're hearing, 100 confirmed dead. Now we're talking about 3, 4, 5 times that many. And that, by the way, is just in Asheville. Meanwhile, the old man on the beach, I'm talking about our POTUS and name only here, on Monday said that he was on the phone for at least 2 hours on Saturday and Sunday, so he'd done all he could for Hurricane Helene relief. And then quickly backtrack on Monday, held a press conference that he mostly coughed his way through. And then made one of his usual curt exits while reporters were still screaming questions at him. Whether or not Biden was actually in command, that's the word he used during his press conference. Bill, the optics of POTUS lounging on the beach while his fellow Americans waited on rooftops for rescue, that was just awful optics. And you studied iconography and the power of imagery. So what did you take away from Biden's beach party and Kamala Harris's fake little photo ops during the weekend?
Well, it's somewhat similar to my topic this week, and what I took away from it is that ain't nobody knows what the hell they're doing, and that's to say the least. I think this has to bear some comparison. This is belated justice, but we all remember when we got started. That was before we started on TV, but when we were all doing our blogs, that George Bush took an incredible shellacking over the way he handled Hurricane Katrina. But let's not forget that George Bush was in Air Force One over New Orleans, looking down at the tragedy, and despite the fact that people were telling him it would be better to be seen on the ground, George Bush said, if I land this airplane and I decide to tour the hardest hit areas, then vital resources are going to have to be deployed to provide my security instead of helping the people that are in need. And he was absolutely vilified for it, and he never recovered from that. That's what got Kanye West to George Bush doesn't care about black people. Now you contrast that with a guy who's actually on the beach on vacation, who puts the ice cream down long enough to make a couple of statements. Look, I'm not one of these people that believes that whenever there's a catastrophe, the president has to be there in person to lead the way.
No, absolutely not.
It's a photo op. Yeah. But what I do want to see is a national press conference where I am given the impression that the full might and resources of the United States of America are being deployed to help our citizens in as timely and effective a fashion as possible. And I didn't get that either. I certainly didn't get that from the vice president. And you can, if you want to go step back even further and really meta this thing out, then you can ask yourself, well, if you did have the full might and resources of the United States government deployed to help our fellow citizens in the middle of this crisis, would this be as effective an operation as the withdrawal from Afghanistan, let's say? So you've got that level on top of it. I don't think the government is doing everything that it can in its power to do. I don't think that there's anybody in the who's not only not in control. Look, the job of the presidency is a very nebulous one in a lot of ways. I don't expect the president to be, doing that tremendous Saturday Night Ronald Reagan, as a super genius sketch where he's making every single call and giving orders. Yeah. But what I do want is I want a president who's in touch with his federal agencies, directing them to maximize the effort, and then reporting to the American people, this is what we're doing, this is how well we're going so far, this is what our plans are to continue in the future, this is what we expect the results would be. And I don't think that's too much to ask from a chief executive. Only problem is we don't have a chief executive. We haven't had a chief executive since January 20th of 2021.
Harsh, but absolutely true. Scott, there are two Americas. I don't care what Barack Obama said. It's not red and blue, though. It's the American government, which is this huge beast that you can barely prod into action except when you don't want it to. And then you've got private sector America that tends to still be able to get stuff done. And while Biden was complaining that, he'd spent all this time on the phone while he was on the beach, Donald Trump and Elon Musk were sending hundreds and hundreds of Starlink terminals to North Carolina to get communications restored. There were supposed to be over 19,000 Starlink terminals in North Carolina already, but the FCC, the Biden-Harris FCC, reneged on a contract they had, and so those evaporated. And this predates Helene, but they're just digging at Starlink and Elon Musk in any way they can. And then you have private charitable organizations like Wings of Hope that I read about at Instapilot, where I'm lucky enough to be a contributor there, that has been raising money for helicopter flights. They just got enough money for 2 more days of day and night helicopter supplies or helicopter flights. They're bringing in supplies and bringing out people. And this is stuff that could have been going on Saturday, because there are a couple of bases you might be aware of on either side of the destruction, one with a bunch of Marines and one with a bunch of 82nd Airborne Air Assault guys. Airborne? I can never remember which is the 82nd and which is the 101st. I'm lost today. Airborne, thank you. With a whole ton of helicopters that could have been doing this already and just hadn't been given the orders. But, Scott, you've been involved in a rescue effort kind of like what's going on here. What do you have to say about the way the private sector handles this as opposed to government?
Well, this is actually 31 years ago this summer. It was the same summer that I married my bride, and there was a major flood in Missouri, and I'm sure in a wider area. But it was so severe that we were concerned that our relatives from the East Coast wouldn't be able to get across the Mississippi to get to us. But the devastation was nowhere near what they're experiencing now in North Carolina, largely because the ground was already saturated in North Carolina, plus the unusual geography of that area, especially western North Carolina with the mountainous areas with landslides and everything. But what I did observe was people just looking for opportunities to help. As the rains were coming in, there were people who just were finding places where they could fill sandbags, and people were talking to people. And this is really like nobody was doing this on the internet. People were making phone calls and going to see people, and so we helped to put some sandbags up around a school, I think, and maybe a public library. And then after a flash flood wiped out some homes in the valley in this little town we lived in, me and a friend who had a truck went down there and basically tried to find out who needed what. And then we drove up to where the Baptist Men's Disaster Relief Team was, where they had a station set up at Pisgah Baptist Church up on the hill. And that was a magnificent operation. I mean, these guys are volunteers in large part, but they are pros. And it's unbelievable the way they had the logistics of this set up, and the attitude of the people who were doing the work. They were cheerful to a man and gracious and loving, and they just wanted to do anything they could to help. So we would go up, pick up supplies, and then take it down to the people who couldn't get out from where they were. And I'm hearing the same kinds of things and more from my daughter, who lives in the area that is now stricken. And she has a whole network of friends who have a kind of a league of assistance. I forget what she called it, but there was just people who are cataloging resources that they have at their disposal and talking to neighbors about how to get to people, who's in jeopardy, who needs what, and they're all teaming together to help each other. I'm torn because on the one hand, I'm critical of the slow government response to things. On the other hand, I want to say to people in disaster relief areas, don't wait for the government. I mean, if anything, that's the lesson of Katrina. The Cajun
Navy is swung into action too. Those guys are great.
Yeah, just get down on it and start doing your work. Now, when it comes to the federal government, I mean, Calvin Coolidge, made the argument that the federal government shouldn't step in the cases of all local natural disasters, and in fact turned down an opportunity to have the government assist in an area that he was from because he said, well, if we help them, then we'll be expected to help everywhere. However, we now have an interstate highway system, and several interstate highways were involved. That's a federal government responsibility largely. The government could be involved there. We have an Army Corps of Engineers who's involved in numerous water projects and lakes and dams around the country. Seems like an obvious area for government help. As you pointed out, in fact, one of my little brothers was a helicopter pilot in the Army, and they were sent to Bangladesh after a typhoon there, and they were flying in supplies to people who were stranded, and they were rescuing people who needed medical care and all that kind of thing. I mean, right now, to get into Asheville, you pretty much need a helicopter, or at least as we record this, because all the major routes in and out of the place were blocked. So, and let me say this about President Biden's 2 hours worth of phone calls. A president of the United States is not the frontline worker in this kind of an operation. That guy should have needed to have a 5-minute meeting with his cabinet and say, get to work, do your responsibilities within the Constitution, help these people, report back to me with what you're doing. And those people should be competent to do the job. He should not be personally steering decisions about which resources go where or who needs what or whatever. Just a brief conversation with somebody at the Pentagon, a brief conversation with somebody in the Department of Transportation. Those people should be doing the work, and his basic vision overall should be guiding it to say, look, here's what I want you to do within the context of budget constraints, within the context of the Constitution. You help these people with everything that we can to help them, and report back to me on how we're doing it. And then we will keep the public informed as to the federal government's involvement. But I think the federal government also has an obligation to share what's going on and to tell people the story of local folks who are busting their tails to help their neighbors.
Yeah, those volunteer organizations work their butts off at great risk and often no pay. As Scott said, they're mostly volunteers. Anybody who's ever needed their help owes them. They know what they owe them. It's everything. We saw a proactive governor in Florida be ready for almost anything, and Florida was not hit nearly as hard as North Carolina, but had pretty much everything up and running in 2 or 3 days after the hurricane swept through. North Carolina, the governor was reactive, and maybe there wasn't much better they could have done, but we'll never know because the governor didn't prepare his state assets that should have been ready to go before the storm started to hit. That said, I want to finish by expanding on what Scott said. The people that make up any organization take their cues from the boss. The boss sets the tone for the organization. And when the boss, no matter what his duties are supposed to be, is seen, his visual, his tone is, you can't interrupt my beach vacation for this. That sets the tone for everybody from him on down. And I got to tell you, that's the tone that Biden has set is one of, we'll get to it when we get to it. And as a result, thank goodness, private America is still America and knows what the hell it's doing. And hopefully we'll rescue a lot more people than we lose. I've got a lot of thoughts and prayers going out to the people of that region right now. All right, that's your right angle on that, brought to you by the members at BillWhittle.com. Thanks so much for watching. We'll see you next time.